us for the North Carolina Conference for Educational Equity, brought to you by the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at North Carolina State University. Welcome to You Can't Give from an Empty Cup, understanding the intersectional impacts of trauma support work on educators. My name is Dr. Patricia Hilliard, and I am your session host. I am here to support our session presenter, who I will introduce shortly, offer technical assistance, as well as share the session evaluation and certificate information at the end. Please do not hesitate to use the chat to ask questions or request technical support. At this time, I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Jason Lynch.
Hi, Dr. Hilliard. Thank you so much for inviting me out here in my office in my home. This is definitely a different medium than we're all used to, but I'm so excited to see so many people here. This is kind of crazy, so in a good way, right? So again, I'm Dr. Jason Lynch. You all can call me Jason. I'm an assistant professor of higher education at the Wright College of Education at Appalachian State University. So we're using Zoom today. I'm pretty used to using Zoom. I teach online using the format, but this is my first time presenting to a group of, at last count, I think we're at 193 and rising. So that is a lot to manage here. Just some housekeeping. Make sure that our microphones are all turned off unless we're speaking. You're welcome to interrupt me, but if there are questions that you have, as Dr. Hilliard said, put them in the chat feature. You're going to be helping me monitor. If there's an urgent question, I've left it to her discretion to interrupt me in the presentation and ask. I'm more than willing to engage in those discussions. And I'm trying to leave some time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to ask questions during that time as well. So our session today is called You Can't Give from an Empty Cup, Understanding the Intersectional Impacts of Trauma Support Work on Educators. So I found that, so in my own research, what I look at is the health and well-being of our educational stakeholders who are not students. I oftentimes feel like they're, obviously the health and well-being of the students that we serve is of utmost importance, but in a lot of the conversations and a lot of the preparation we have, whether it's in K through 12 or P through 12, or even higher education, sort of our own well-being as educators and how we manage ourselves is kind of put off to the side. So in my research, I really try to center the health and well-being of staff, faculty, and educational leaders in different educational organizations. So one more thing that I want to kind of address before we get into the bulk of the presentation is that whenever I'm speaking about intersectional impacts, I'm not going to speak to a specific identity group during the presentation. I really believe that, and I'll explain this in a little bit, but trauma can really be informed by the intersectional identities that you hold. So whether it's the intersections of sexual orientation and race, or race and gender, or all three, or different other identities that you might have around ability, or nationality, things like that, can all really impact how you're either allowed to express your trauma from a societal perspective, or how you might even experience your own trauma. So I try to use terms pretty broadly, but we're going to be addressing later on in the presentation sort of the intersections of these pieces as well. So to get started, our session goals for today, or at least what I hope to be our session goals, one is understanding the need to address professional well-being alongside student well-being. I want you all to be able to differentiate terms such as trauma, secondary trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue, and emotional labor. So we're not going to spend too much time with regard to unpacking these terms, but I just want you to get a sort of a base level understanding of what I'm talking about and be able to differentiate these items. I also want you to be able to recognize common factors that lead to the development and response to trauma exposure. So what I mean by trauma exposure is the students that you might be working with that are experiencing trauma. I also want you to be able to situate the role of marginalization in exacerbating existing outcomes related to trauma support work. So how does the possession of a marginalized identity or multiple marginalized identity as an educator impact your ability to process and help students through trauma? I want you to be able to reflect on your own potential trauma responses resulting from supporting a traumatized student. And then finally, I'm presenting some ideas at the end, so I want you to be able to consider these ideas to address systemic changes needed to increase trauma resiliency in educational professionals, or education professionals. So first, why do we even need to discuss this topic, right? So it should all be about the students, right? We're really concerned with their well-being. So why is it important for us to discuss our own well-being? So one interesting statistic that comes out from some of the national data sets around adverse childhood experiences. So more than 2/3 of children in the US have reported at least one traumatic event by the age of 16. We also see that institutions of education are increasingly being called upon to address and support traumatized youth. So I know that most of us here are K through 12 educators. So how many professional development events have you probably been to or been invited to that address how you can be more trauma informed or address students experiencing different crises depending on your role at your school? So one thing that I've noticed too is that few professional preparation programs, so what I mean by that are your colleges of education or your education programs, your degree programs, or continuing education opportunities or professional development in schools. So few of them provide focused and continued training regarding trauma and trauma resiliency when it comes to educators. So there's a lot of opportunity to speak about trauma-informed practices when it comes to creating trauma-informed school communities for the students. But one of the missing pieces of the puzzle in creating a trauma-informed community is the helping professional that provides that support and how they manage trauma. So this all kind of culminates in an interesting statistic from a national CDC set that talks about how 51% of employers, and so this isn't just education, but just sort of nationwide, 51% of employers view mental health as the biggest threat to staff health. There's a lot of other statistics that speak to use of sick leave, attrition in jobs, and all of that due to burnout and compassion fatigue and things like that within helping professions. So why discuss this topic? Well, it's because when it comes to promoting the balance between student well-being and professional well-being, the system's broken. And so I know the purpose of this conference is really to explore these systemic issues and create bold and actionable ideas that are related to addressing these issues. So before we get into some of these ideas, right, I want to lay up groundwork for what we mean by trauma. So I know a lot of you have probably attended professional development events that discuss the concepts of trauma and how it might relate to teaching or interactions with students. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpacking that, but I just wanted to get us on the same page of what I'm talking about with trauma. So first, trauma might be thought of as the result of an overwhelming stressor that exceeds an individual's ability to cope. So whenever you're thinking about trauma, it has both psychological and physiological impacts, right? So it's not just about the impact on somebody's mental health, but chronic and sustained traumatic experiences or traumatic stress can cause physiological impacts. So increased blood pressure, decreased immune systems can leave you more susceptible to other illnesses. And kind of going back to this definition of trauma as an overwhelming stressor, whenever one thinks of trauma, a lot of times you're thinking about what we call a big T trauma. So those really acute incidents that you might stereotype as a traumatic experience, right? So maybe a large natural disaster, maybe a global pandemic. Those things might be considered more of a big T trauma, right? But there's also the little T trauma. So the cumulative impacts of these can be just as impactful over time as a big T trauma. So little T traumas just might be hearing about experiences of other folks that have experienced trauma over time. Little T traumas like microaggressions, right? We've talked about those within the context of equity work. So the build of those over time can really create trauma responses. And so another assumption that I kind of want to talk about with trauma, and particularly how it applies to my research, is the ripple effect of trauma. So whenever I explain this in other presentations around my research in secondary traumatic stress, I use this metaphor of throwing a stone into a pond, right? So you can think of the stone as the traumatic event. And whenever you throw it into the pond, it creates ripples. And so the first ripple you might think of as the primary trauma victim, right? So that might be the students that you're working with. Maybe they're experiencing home insecurity or food insecurity. Maybe they've experienced a sexual assault or a bias-related incident, right? So that first ripple is the primary trauma victim. So really where I look at and the focus of this presentation is more about the secondary ripple. So those are more the people that are working with the primary trauma victim. So professional helpers such as teachers, social workers, school counselors, principals, from a higher ed perspective, the student affairs professionals and faculty. How are those folks impacted by the trauma from the primary trauma victim? So as we're talking about this and these secondary responses, there are a few terms or concepts that are frequently associated as outcomes from supporting individuals through trauma. So we talk about burnout, secondary trauma, and compassion fatigue. And what I found in my own research and kind of going through the literature is that we really focus a lot on this idea of burnout and compassion fatigue. And a lot of times these words are kind of conflated with each other, used interchangeably, but they're actually separate concepts. So I'm hoping to differentiate those a little bit for you. So first is this concept of burnout, right? So burnout is really related to these job-related stressors. There's specific sort of symptomologies that are associated with burnout: depersonalization, increased sort of negative feelings towards one's job or profession. But these are really, burnout can kind of occur in any profession. It's really due to this sort of overworked, under-resourced concept, right? It doesn't necessarily have to deal with trauma. Where I kind of look at is this idea of secondary traumatic stress, right? So like I explained in the last slide, this ripple effect. So working with the primary trauma victim, those that are in professional helping roles can actually take on some of the symptoms of trauma responses themselves. But whenever you combine burnout with secondary traumatic stress, you can get a response known as compassion fatigue, right? So compassion fatigue is really around this idea that this numbing. So you think about in your own experiences, right? If you've worked with students or multiple students that have experienced traumatic events. So perhaps they're coming one after the other during the school year. And at the beginning of the school year, you might be very, very gung-ho about helping. You're like, yes, like I'm providing all the resources, and I'm really excited to provide all of these resources, and I'm feeling really empathetic towards these students. But by the end of the year, after perhaps 15, 20 cases, ongoing sort of management of these issues, you're feeling a lot more numb to the experiences of the students, or perhaps you just feel like you don't have any more to give. And so that's this idea of compassion fatigue. And you think of this as sort of this intersection between burnout and secondary traumatic stress. I want to check time to make sure that I think we have till 12:30. There we go. So this model is Barnes's model of compassion fatigue. So I just want to make sure I'm giving credit to that group. So far we've talked about this idea of what trauma is, right? And we've talked about different outcomes of professional helping when it comes to trauma. So we talked, I've given a very high level overview of burnout, this idea of secondary trauma, of helping individuals that are experiencing trauma, and compassion fatigue. But what do these responses look like in real life? So again, for those of you that might have attended workshops around traumatic stress in students, this might look familiar, but I'm really wanting us to look at this within the context of your own personal experiences, or maybe even the experiences of your coworkers that you might have observed. So Lipsky and Burt, this is the citation here, and there's a resource at the end of this presentation. I'll make sure that this gets sent out. But there's a book called Trauma Stewardship, and it's about sort of the idea of the impact of this professional helping work and different behaviors that might indicate a trauma response or trauma exposure response. So first is this idea of minimizing, right? So I often see this in my coworkers. I have, before my faculty position, I spent about 10 years in college student affairs working in residence life, specifically with some other, in multicultural affairs with some other areas that really exposed me to a lot of different student traumas. And so what I've noticed in coworkers, or even in the K through 12 environment, we're so used to and normalize this idea of working with individuals that are experiencing trauma that it becomes normal for us, right? So we kind of minimize the impact of this. We're like, oh, it's no big deal. It's not like, this is just a part of the job. Like it really wasn't that much. that stressful of an event, right? But really it might be. So that's this idea of minimizing. Hypervigilance is something that I see quite often in the interviews that I've been doing with different educational stakeholders. So hypervigilance is this idea of always this feeling that the other shoe is going to drop, or always on the lookout for dangers that are around you, right? So it kind of gives you this heightened sense of sensitivity. You might be a little bit more on edge. And I see that a lot with educators that are working with students that experience or they're experiencing trauma. This idea of a sense of persecution. So how many of you, it's sort of a rhetorical question, right? But how many of you have seen peers or maybe even in yourself, this idea that somebody's out to get you, right? So it kind of goes along with this idea of hypervigilance, that you're always on edge. So you're more susceptible to thinking that you're more susceptible to taking things personally, or this idea that the organization or some other entity is kind of out to get you in response to kind of this always being on edge. Deliberate avoidance. So that's another idea that so after kind of this exposure to trauma, you want to avoid thoughts or places or things that remind you of this trauma incident. So within the case of educators working with students experiencing trauma, that might be avoiding wanting to work with particular students. It could take the form of excessive absenteeism at work, right? So it's just such an overwhelming experience that you don't want to necessarily have to engage in those practices anymore. It could also take the form of trying to avoid thoughts. So if you're trying to process with a peer, or perhaps you're supervising somebody that is dealing with a lot of trauma support work, they might not want to talk about it and process it. So there could be this idea of deliberate avoidance of wanting to even think about the support that's being provided. Dissociative moments. So this is the idea that so you, as you're engaging in support work or even engaging in your day-to-day activities, you might kind of feel this idea that you're watching yourself perform these tasks. So this almost out-of-body experience that you're feeling. I recognize whenever I was working in a residence life, there's a couple different occasions where I was a first responder to a student that had completed suicide. And so I remember kind of in the weeks after those moments, I would be going through the motions of doing sort of the more administrative parts of my job or handling some other crisis, and kind of looking in on myself and being like, oh, wait, like it almost feels like I'm watching myself just kind of go through these motions. Diminished creativity. So I think that is a very acute trauma response that we're experiencing right now through this global pandemic. I feel like a lot of us are being asked to continue doing the work that we've been doing pre-pandemic, whether that's teaching or supporting students and things like that. But now we're being asked to do be creative and think of new ways to to deliver the same sort of services that we've always have been doing in similar ways. And so when you're experiencing a trauma exposure response, this idea of being able to be creative and think of new ideas is severely diminished. You just don't have the energy to expend on thinking of new ways of doing things. This idea of feeling hopeless and helpless is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of times feelings of guilt, fear, anger, cynicism are common responses following trauma exposure responses. The inability to embrace complexity. So think about your mind whenever, or think about the mind whenever there's a trauma exposure, right? You've heard of this idea of flight or fight, right? So your brain kind of takes over. We were kind of relating this to hypervigilance and sense of persecution. There's always this idea, all right, is there danger lurking around somewhere? So this intersects with this inability to embrace complexity, because your mind kind of takes over and you're in this state of black and white thinking, right? So I need to be safe. Your mind's trying to protect you in these ways, and so the ability to understand nuance or embrace complexity is severely limited whenever you're experiencing a trauma response. A sense that one can never do enough. I find that this often is something that's prevalent in education environments. So we're asked to be all things at all times to all people, it seems like. So I think it almost becomes normalized in educational cultures, whether it's K through 12 or higher education, that we just can never do enough. It's just always, there's always more work to do. There's always more responses to give. And then obviously chronic exhaustion and physical ailments follow along with a lot of these responses. There's this idea of grandiosity or inflated sense of self-importance. So what I've noticed too in people that are, or in educators that are working with particularly severe cases of student trauma, they develop these relationships, right, with the students, and it can almost turn into this, well, I know the student best, I know what they need, I'm the one that could provide, I'm the only one that could provide the support to the student. And so it's this idea that this inflated sense of self, and almost to the point of it could be like a savior kind of complex, right? But it kind of loops back in some of these other things, right? So black and white thinking, where inability to embrace complexity, this idea of just really wanting to be there and not being able to do enough, and so you're kind of inserting yourself in that way. And then finally, in the inability to empathize or numbing. So we go back to this idea of compassion fatigue, right? So just kind of the chronic exhaustion just leads to, and energy depletion leads to this inability to empathize with the person that that is experiencing the trauma or numbing. But it can also kind of lead into other aspects of your job, right? So perhaps you just don't have the ability to empathize, you're numb to the experiences of your coworkers, right? So perhaps you're a little bit more short-tempered. You're not able to kind of empathize with what their experiences are. So that could also be a trauma response. So I know that was a pretty hefty list, but I'm hoping that you were able to kind of or reflect on the question about, have you ever noticed any of these behaviors in yourself or your peers, particularly following support of students through trauma or cumulative trauma responses over the course of the year?
Dr. Lynch, I have a wonder statement that was in the chat that seemed interesting.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I was Katina, and I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong. Katina shared that if she wondered if deliberate avoidance, and then also kind of some of the other ones that are listed there, is misinterpreted by teachers or administrators as a student being lazy, or in our cases, an adult being lazy. Have you ever experienced that or read about that?
Yes, definitely. That is definitely something that I've seen in my own research where oftentimes, and I'll contextualize this since we're talking about staff, or staff and educational professionals in this session, that yeah, like a deliberate avoidance can definitely shows up with supervisor responses being like, oh, well, like that person is they have excessive absences, or like, oh, why did you take that sick day? I found that that's something that's really interesting within the K through 12 population, is that it seems like there's no ability to take a sick day, and there's this sort of internal policing that goes on within that population that doesn't allow you to kind of take care of yourself. So even whether it's supervisors or coworkers, this deliberate avoidance can definitely be seen as sort of laziness or not wanting to do one's job. I think often what happens is that we make these assumptions, and particularly within the context of equity, I think that depending on what identities you might hold, this can be exacerbated, right? So whenever you're thinking about racial inequities, like there might be more harsh responses, or more quick, or colleagues or supervisors might be more quick to judge that somebody is lazy or not doing their work. But what they don't understand is that perhaps they're carrying more of a load of supporting particular students through trauma that we'll talk about in a little bit, and that and they never ask the question about, like, how are you doing as an educator, like what's leading to this. It just is this automatic assumption of laziness.
Yes, and Tracy brought up the other symptom is perfectionism. When I'm perfect. And you might be getting to this later on in your presentation. The other question that was elevated that I want to elevate in the chat is from Jimmy Frederick Jr. Is there a way in which administrators can proactively deal with issues, knowing that, I mean, in the chat, some people shared about administrator burnout as well, because we're the one who is dealing with the teacher's issues, the students' challenges. So I don't know if you're going to get to that later on in your presentation.
Well, so I think that from an administrator point of view, I know I keep kind of going back to the example of teachers, but whenever I say educational professional, I was hoping to design this presentation to include everybody, right? So whether they're school counselors, social workers, administrators, even or teachers and higher education professionals. And so I think that yes, this definitely applies to the administrative professionals, because you can think of them like they're getting they're getting all the stuff from up top with the districts and the and parents and all these things, and kind of this all the responses on the bottom with working with teachers, and they might even also be working with individual students as well. So we'll talk about some of those things in sort of the practical implications section at the end. So if I don't answer your question at that point, please make sure to circle back and call me out, and I'll make sure to speak about it in a little more detail. Okay.
I will.
Perfect. Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about these trauma responses, right? So as educational professionals, we're supporting students with traumas. We might be experiencing these things ourselves, or our coworkers might be experiencing these things. So what might exacerbate some of this? Like who might be at greater risk of experiencing some of these trauma exposure responses, right? So one thing to note that I didn't do in the last slide is that an individual might not experience all of these, right? They might experience one or more, and the extent to which somebody experiences a trauma response might be different, right? So it's not a one size fits all idea. So what are some predictive factors here for trauma exposure responses? So one is an empathetic disposition, which I think is really interesting, particularly within helping professions like education, because empathy is something that we're taught that we should be having towards our students, right, or each other, and it very much makes sense within the context of education. But it's this paradox that the more empathetic you are, or the more naturally empathetic you are, the greater the risk that you have of experiencing a trauma response, right? Because you're able to sort of almost feel the emotions that are coming off of that person that you're trying to support. And interesting with this prior experience with particular trauma, I've been able to see this, particularly within my own research, is that if you are supporting a student through a particular kind of trauma, so let's say that you have experienced homelessness before, or you have experienced sexual assault before, and you are working with a student that has experienced that same trauma, you might be able to really provide some excellent resources for that student from your own personal experience, but it leaves you kind of more open to experience a trauma response. And it kind of ties back into this ability to empathize because you've experienced that before. So it leaves you more open to re-experiencing a response to the trauma. Exposure time. So definitely there's some experiences where they're so impactful that one exposure could, so such as the death of a student, perhaps, like that could be a really impactful one-time thing. But more lower level, or I shouldn't say lower level, but exposure time to a person experiencing trauma is definitely a factor in predicting a secondary response to trauma. So if you're an administrator or a teacher and you're working with the same student for an extended period of time that's experiencing a prolonged traumatic experience, and your chances of having a trauma response go up as well. Not all traumas are created equal, but in producing a trauma response. And so what I found in my own research is that in looking at, I think I've looked at kind of 15 different kinds of traumatic experiences, but one's related to bias-related incidences, suicidal ideation, attempt or completion, and severe mental health episodes tend to be some of the top three that predict secondary trauma responses in the professional helpers that I'll look at. And then finally, this is not something I'm gonna stick on with this slide because we're gonna explore it in a later slide. But possession of a marginalized identity. So within the context of race, if you identify as Black, or a person, a Black, Indigenous, person of color, gender, if you belong to or identify as a woman, or identify outside of sort of the traditional gender spectrum, or with sexual orientation, identifying as non-heterosexual, all of these things kind of can be predictive of a secondary trauma response. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but it's more about the environment in which you're having to function, right? Because you're kind of fighting off all of these all these systemic issues that you're dealing with personally on top of handling the traumas of someone else. So we talked about trauma, right? We talked about secondary trauma, but on top of all this, in education, we're asked to perform a lot of emotional labor that kind of compounds this issue of secondary trauma responses. So whenever I'm talking about emotional labor, it can be thought of as the process of managing feelings and expressions to fulfill an emotional or the emotional requirements of a job, right? So in this previous slide, we talked about all these different feelings. Let's see, all these different things that you could be experiencing as a result of supporting a student through trauma, right? So you could be feeling hopeless and helpless, or guilt, fear, anger, exhausted, physical ailments, right? But within the context of education, we're always asked to put those aside, right? Because the student comes first, and we need to make sure that their needs are being fulfilled. And so we need to be able to conjure up these feelings of, or at least expressions of empathy, of joy, of happiness, of at the very least calmness, right? But that also takes a toll on us. So through this concept of emotional labor, there's three kinds of emotional labor. So there's this idea of surface acting, deep acting, and natural expression. So in surface acting is sort of the most base level emotional labor component. It's where sort of you have these really intense internal feelings. So perhaps you are feeling that guilt or anger, or cynicism or whatever it is you're feeling internally, but you're literally just kind of fixing your face. I get told that a lot, just fix your face, right? So you put on a smile, and you just kind of sit there, right? So that's surface acting. Deep acting is sort of a more intense version of emotional labor. So you're asked to recall sort of an internal experience to be able to project a more authentic expression on your face. So perhaps you recall a really good memory, and that or you kind of think about something that's a happy time or a happy place, and that helps you provide a more authentic expression for whatever is appropriate at the time. But then there's this idea of natural expression, right? So that's actually kind of expressing what you're feeling in the moment, whether it's sadness or anger or depression or whatever it is, right? But what's interesting when you kind of look at the educators or professional helpers' responses in these areas, so surface and deep acting have actually been linked to increased rates of burnout and decreased reports of job satisfaction and psychological well-being. Because when you're suppressing all of these negative emotions, right, and you're not allowed a space to process all of these things, they kind of bubble up, and oftentimes they bubble up at unwanted times. And so what I've found in particularly educational organizations, we spend so much time focusing on students and focusing on getting our jobs done that there's no space that's created for us to kind of lift the lid on the pot so we don't boil over, right? We need this space to process and to be authentic with the emotions that we're experiencing. So as I mentioned before, there's this idea that, or the evidence has been shown that possession of a marginalized identity or multiple marginalized identities leaves somebody or leaves an individual at greater risk of experiencing trauma, or particularly a secondary trauma response, or even the ways that they're able to manage or express emotional labor in those ways. So I've adapted this socio-ecological model to kind of help visualize what we mean by this and why this might occur within marginalized populations. So at the center of this, right, we have our educational professional that brings their personal histories, experiences, and identities to the table. So you can think about your own identity. So for me, I identify as a gay white cisgender man, right? So I bring all of those histories and experiences and either privileges or the lack thereof to the table. But I'm kind of existing within this relationship environment, right? So those are sort of the immediate day-to-day interactions that I have. So you have professional learning communities that you're managing. You have your emotional labor expectations with your students. You have other peer stakeholders like your administrators or supervisors within the school or co-partners in other departments. But then perhaps you're also supporting these students and families that are experiencing trauma. So while you're managing all of your trauma or your responses perhaps to supporting these students and families, you're also managing as a person that with these intersecting identities, how you're showing up in these PLCs or with peer stakeholders and all the expectations that kind of come along with that. So on a broader level, right, you have community and policy, so school level, the surrounding school communities that the school's embedded in, district and school board leadership, or even state level policies that are impacting sort of these relationships that you're having as an educational professional. But then on the or sort of like the greater circle, right, you have the societal impacts. So as we've been able to acutely experience over the past few weeks, but for many others for much longer, this idea of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism that impacts how these policies are created, impacts the culture of these surrounding communities, that then impacts your relationships on a day-to-day basis. And so as an educational professional with a marginalized identity, you're not just supporting the student through and their family, perhaps through a traumatic experience. You're supporting them, and you're also managing all these institutional inequities that you're exposed to on a daily basis. And then on top of that too, there's also this expectation a lot of times that persons that are identifying with particular identity groups or supporting students that are identifying in those same groups. So I've experienced in departments where I've been the only gay person, perhaps, that oh, like this person is having an issue coming out, or they're having an issue related to their sexual orientation. So obviously Jason should be the expert since he's the gay guy in the room, right? Or it could be if you identify as a Black person, right, that you're the one that's expected to deal with all the issues that are coming from the Black students in the school. So there's this inequitable burden that is being set upon you based upon the identities that you might hold. That's kind of a function of all of these different levels in the environment that you're working in. So all of that, right, leads to a lot of management of a lot of different feelings and emotions and responses that you're having. So all of this is to say that there's a lot of stuff we're dealing with, right? And so really this conference is about needed systemic changes. And so in my presentation, we're talking about systemic changes to promote trauma resiliency in educators. And so first I want to recognize that when we're talking about systemic changes, really part of what we're doing here, hopefully through this conference as well, is addressing some of the issues that cause trauma in students, that way we're not having to provide as much intense support because they're already receiving the support or receiving or being able to be in environments in which they're not experiencing the traumas to begin with, right? But in the interim, we're not going to be able to wave a magic wand in the near future to kind of fix all of that, right? So in the meantime, how are we creating systemic changes to promote trauma resiliency in our educators to be able to help students and be able to show up in a more helpful way for our students? So I've divided them into sort of three different levels of recommendations here. So the district system level, organization level, and peer and individual level. So I'm going to try to go through these fairly quickly so we can leave time for question and answers. But first with the district level, I find that we don't really have a lot of information that's related to the health and well-being of our educators. So assessment and data is really important, and it's also linked to financial resources, right? Because unfortunately, in some cases, for people or for policymakers to give us money to address situations, they need to see numbers and graphs and things like that, right? But what I've also found is there seems to be this like lack of trust in, or lack of ability to access education populations. I've found it very hard to try to access K through 12 participants to really understand what their experiences are with some of these ideas like secondary trauma. So without this information, we're really unable to make specific recommendations or or create resources for our education professionals. Human resource policy is really something that we need to start addressing for systemic change, right? So it's addressing staff well-being. Example, so crises including student deaths, bias-related incidents, or cumulative traumas. I've seen in several cases where there might be a student death, and so counselors are brought in for the families and students and things like that. But I've heard story after story about how there's nothing necessarily brought in for the administrators, teachers, student support staff for them to be able to engage in ongoing processing of those events. Yet those are the same professionals that are in the building that are supporting everybody else and probably had a relationship with that student that was that who passed or was experiencing some of these other traumas, right? So how are we creating policies and procedures to make sure the entire community is being taken care of during these situations. Workers' compensation is actually something that I've been harping on for a little bit within the context of secondary traumatic stress. Workers' compensation is a state-by-state sort of concept. And so what qualifies for workers' compensation in one state might not in the other. But I really think that we need to be reworking what it looks like to receive workers' compensation. So if you were an educational professional that has developed anxiety, depression, some other mental health issue related to continuous exposure via your sort of helping professional role, but you deserve to be compensated for that and deserve to have finances to access resources to help you navigate that, whether it's counseling or other means, right? And then finally, from the district level, the districts tend to, or even the system level at the university, right? We do a lot of trainings, but I feel like we often lack training that focuses on trauma-informed leadership or trauma-informed supervision or trauma-informed approaches to managing other folks in organizations. So I really think that that's something that would benefit. I often find in my research that a lot of secondary trauma responses are also linked to poor supervision and poor leadership. And so that being able to train leaders and supervisors to one spot trauma responses in education professionals and be able to link them to resources would be very important. From an organizational level, distribution of emotional labor, right? So it goes back to this tracking and making sure that we're not overburdening teachers or other educational professionals, and in particularly those that are possessing marginalized identities with excessive emotional labor. So just because somebody is identifying as or has a particular identity doesn't mean that you automatically need to usher a student over to make sure that they are they're kind of matched up. There needs to be a discussion that takes place first. Continuing education, there's a lot of resources or a lot of literature that shows that just the kind of exposure to understanding what secondary trauma or compassion fatigue or emotional labor, just being introduced to those concepts helps professional helpers to recognize things within themselves and leads to more positive outcomes. So continuing education around this is extremely important. From an organizational or school-based level, it's important to have regular check-ins and build support networks. One of the key mitigators of trauma responses is access to a support network. And so this could take the form of making sure that you're regularly leaving time in staff meetings or creating a regular meeting time. Maybe it's once a semester at the end or something where you can debrief and really kind of engage in that discussion around your emotional responses to supporting students. Building psychological safety that leads back into organizational leadership. So there needs to be this idea of psychological safety, be able to discuss and divulge your responses, right? So if you don't feel safe in your organization, you're probably not going to feel safe enough to talk about your trauma responses, and so that you're going to keep that to yourself and not be able to process, and that just compounds the situation, right? And then also the idea of role clarification. I recognize both in higher ed and K through 12, a lot of times that there can be a lot of bleeding over in roles where you think that you're getting into one role and you end up doing a lot of extra duties and in roles that are not necessarily associated with the job that you applied for. And so making sure that there's equity and transparency, whether it's in the hiring process or an onboarding processes around role clarification, to be able to adjust expectations. And then finally, from a peer and individual level, being able to reframe your thoughts through a trauma-informed lens, right? So I often find that we're not very kind to one another in education, particularly whenever it comes to things like what we were discussing earlier with absenteeism or being able to give somebody the benefit of the doubt that perhaps they are experiencing a trauma response. So being able to reframe if you're finding challenging behaviors in yourself or in peers, like how is it that, or what questions could you ask to better understand if this is a trauma response or if this is a response to burnout or something like that, right? Pausing before unsolicited request of emotional labor. So one of the things I didn't speak of in the slide before is that, yes, there's emotional labor that's associated with supporting students. But there's also emotional labor. So think about deep acting, surface acting, natural expression that I was talking about with your peers or supervisors. How often is it that that you're having to kind of put on this face to be able to listen to somebody complain about something, right? So that's a form of emotional labor that could really drain your energy. So making sure that you're not a part of that. So before you're engaging with a colleague, think through, is this a form of emotional labor that you're requesting of your peer? And if so, like making sure that you're kind of being explicit in this request. Like, are you okay with listening to me talk about some of these things, and being able to be offer reciprocation for that? So like, make sure you're asking about them as well. Being able to self-check. I provided some resources in the final slide with some citations around different metrics that you could use for self-checks. Part of my research, I developed a scale that measures secondary traumatic stress in student support professionals. So being able to look out for tools like that to be able to self-assess and engage whether or not you might want to seek help. And then finally, boundary setting. I recognize that is sort of a complicated concept from an individual level, right? Because sometimes we work in environments that don't allow us to set boundaries. But boundary setting is one of the most important things that we can do to take care of ourselves in these situations. So being able to understand what our boundaries are, being able to say no, or being able to reinforce the boundaries that we have set. All right, so I think we're right at schedule. So I think we have enough time for about 10 or 15 minutes worth of questions if we want to ask any.
There is a question about, oh my gosh, there's so many statements that I want to bring up. First of all, there's been comments in the chat about earlier on about support that will be needed, ongoing continued support post-COVID.
Yes.
Have any reflections or insights on what's going to happen when we go back to schools, knowing that, and someone shared it in the chat, and I'm sorry I can't find it right now, that some students and staff are at home with their triggers right now?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that so again, I kind of like focus on staff and the other educational professionals, right, in this particular session. So I think one of the things that's really going to be important. So one, I'll be very transparent, is I'm kind of on the side of like, I think we should be. We're battling this at our own institutions right now at the colleges about whether or not we should be going back or whatnot. But if we are returning, I do think that the leaderships of people in leadership roles at the school really need to be setting up times for people to be able to process through those things, whether students or staff and faculty. I think that, yes, we're sitting at home with our triggers, we're sitting at home with our different trauma responses, and oftentimes there's not space to process, or we're the only people that we're able to process with are the people in our household. So I know that, so my partner is a K through 12 education professional. I work in education. We're constantly kind of just immersed in this, and we only kind of have each other to talk to about it. And so I think I would encourage our people in leadership positions to intentionally create spaces to where we can process through some of these things on a very regular basis. Because I think oftentimes what happens with situations like training around trauma responses and things like that is that, oh, we're going to have a workshop on this, and it's going to be a one-time thing, maybe at the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year. But for this to really have a sustained impact, it needs to have a sustained impact. We need to do this on a regular basis, because I've talked about, just because I processed this once in an hour span with some other folks doesn't mean that I don't need to do that again later on, right?
The questions are flying in.
Yeah. That's why I put the responsibility on you to get through them, right?
I want to kind of combine Mark's idea and some earlier ideas about the post-COVID, and then I will move on to Jeremy and Beth's question. So Mark is specifically asking about strategies to provide for handling the level of trauma and grief due to COVID-19 and racial injustice. I would like to add to that, in your knowing what you know about the research on trauma for adults as well as adolescents and children, if you could plan a 6-month program, a sustainable program, I'm not going to put a time limit on it. If you could plan a sustainable program, what would be some of the highlights? I don't want to say highlights and trauma at the same time, but what would make it an impactful program?
Oh, that's interesting.
No
Um,
budget, just what would
yeah,
it
my magic wand, right?
be?
So I think that one, it needs to be small groups. I think you need to have, if we're talking about no budget, I would definitely be able to contract out with other professional helpers. I think that oftentimes we rely too much on our school counselors to provide that support for everyone. And school counselors are already having to do a number of different things in addition to like basic counseling work, right? So I think being able to contract out other mental health professionals throughout this period. I know you said 6 months, but maybe we'll just talk about an academic year where they can be brought in. I think uh, group sessions are most helpful, and being able to kind of group people by the traumas that they're really wanting to process. So perhaps you might have groups on the intersections between this impact of COVID-19 and racial incidents that are happening, right? So people that are really having acute responses to those intersections are able to process with each other, versus somebody that's having a complete or trauma reaction to somebody else, right? I think these things need to happen probably on a weekly basis. I would incorporate that. I think that so we talked about bringing in out or contracting outside help. We talk about small groups. Talk about putting them in small groups that are of similar sort of trauma experiences and doing this on a very regular basis. And I think it needs to happen. Obviously for student groups, but also making sure we're being intentional and doing it with faculty and staff. I also feel like I'd want to explore the idea of perhaps instead of doing it from a school on a school basis, it's more of a district basis. That way, people of similar roles can be with each other, because you have to be, when you're talking about psychological safety and you're talking about wanting people to be open and authentic in these groups, right? If I'm a teacher and I'm in a small group processing my trauma with my principal in the room, am I really going to be able to be that authentic, right? So being intentional about how those groups are made up, and thinking through how people can be their most authentic selves within that, I think would be the most helpful. And then finally, tracking. I think it's really important that you're completing self-assessments or being able to gauge in measurable ways that this might be helpful. I think you need to you need to be surveying your staff and helping to understand how they're defining safety, how they're whether that's psychological or physical safety, and what their hopes and outcomes are for a program like this. That way, you're meeting them where they're at, and you're directly engaging the needs that they're requesting. So I guess that's sort of my initial thoughts on that particular.
Small groups, district wide, kind of maybe role alike, and tracking that is what I heard.
Yeah.
So the first part of the conference theme is for us to rethink our practices, and I've seen some things in the chat about when you had that slide up that talked about some educators feel guilty about asking for a day off. There's some people who shared, my boss wouldn't let me have a day off. And then someone else shared, what is the line between self-care and being selfish? Are there times to suck it up and do what is asked? That first conference theme is to rethink. Well, a lot of times in education, we put student first and then at our own expense. So what do you think is the line between being selfish and being taking care of yourself? I think.
Yeah, I think that so there's a chapter that's coming out that I've co-written on this idea of the ideal worker norms. And so this is kind of a heady concept, but in America, we've really been socialized that the ideal worker is somebody that has no emotions, that somebody that puts the organization's well-being over their own well-being, and that they sort of make this sacrifice for the greater good of whatever business or organization that they're a part of. And I really see that is wildly exacerbated within the education system. And again, whether that's K through 12 or higher education, I think that I think when you're talking about a line between self-care and selfishness, I think that if you're just like, oh, I don't want to do my job, I have no sort of sympathy for students or my peers or anything like that, then yeah, that's selfish, I guess. But I think whenever you're like, I'm exhausted and I just need, I think pushing yourself is a result of these ideal worker norms, and that as educators, we're constantly asked to push ourselves in ways that people in other professions are not asked to push themselves, and then we're also not compensated. So like you have these other professions where you can take those days off, and those people are getting paid 3 or 4 times as much as educators are, but we're performing twice the emotional labor and all those other aspects. And I also think it kind of goes back to this idea of policing. I think that in education, there's so much policing of like, well, she took this day off. Why is she doing that? Or he took this day off. And it was like, really, it's none of your business why somebody took a day off. You don't know their life. You don't know what they're going through. And I think that that's one of the things we really need to rethink is how we're policing each other, as opposed to kind of taking these negative energies and putting it towards systemic change and kind of challenging our policymakers and our district leaders about why. So instead of fighting internally, like turning that energy and fighting up above.
Yes, yes. We have 5 minutes left. I do want to give people time to complete the evaluation, which I will share in 1 second. I just want to elevate one more question that was mentioned earlier about academic programs. It was mentioned in the chat that university programs don't really address trauma. If you could design a course, what would be some topics that you would have in that course?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm actually developing a couple classes at App State for that, because I definitely agree. I think we're focused on particularly in K through 12, is focused on like pedagogy and cultural responsiveness and all these super important things, but we leave out this idea of trauma, particularly with that stat that went or the number of students that are experiencing trauma by age 16. But what are the courses I'm developing from a K through or from a higher ed lens is the trauma informed university. So I think that we could duplicate that. And so like, what does the trauma informed campus look like? Of course, around trauma. So looking at trauma informed teaching practices, looking at trauma or cultural responsiveness from a trauma informed lens. How are we looking at community care from a trauma informed lens, and kind of using that as a basis for course development? I think that would be very interesting. But that's definitely something I'm hoping to address in future research, is sort of professional preparation and education from a trauma-informed perspective.
I think that is needed. We've got some amens, we've got some agrees in the chat. There's lots of thank yous that are in the chat. Dr. Lynn, go ahead.
I just want to leave with this one last sort of idea, right? And then I'll turn it back over. So I wanted to just really reemphasize that. So the name of this session was right. You can't pour from an empty cup. So while it's true that we cannot pour from an empty cup, we have been conditioned to believe that it's solely our responsibility to get a refill. So it's past time for policymakers, district leaders, and administrators to create equitable systems and practices that facilitate self-care and well-being for those that sacrifice so much for the students and families they serve. So, and this is just some contact information for people that want to follow up or reach out afterwards. But thank you.
Thank you. That's a powerful way to end. Thank you so much for agreeing to be here and to share your knowledge with the rest of us. I have shared in the chat, and I will continue to share in the chat the evaluation. It is a very quick evaluation of the session. We look forward to collecting your thoughts and knowing ways in which we can improve this experience for you. After you complete the evaluation, there will be a certificate of attendance. If you need that, that's how you get it, is by completing it. Also, there's an optional end of the day reflection, because depending upon what session that you go to, you may need some time to reflect. That is at 3:15. Here is the session evaluation. Thank you so much. Hope to see you in other sessions as well.
Thank you all so much.
Samantha? Oh, she's gone. I don't know if you saw it in there. It was a question if they could enroll in your class if they were an alumni.
Well, I've actually been thinking about trying to do more of like a MOOC style class for those that are interested. So like it's a kind of massive open free access course. So if people are interested in something like that, feel free to email me if there's interest. Then I would love to put something together for people that are interested in doing sort of a multi-week workshop on some of these issues.